Order, and welcome everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, when we are taking evidence about the government's cost of living support payments. A warm welcome to our first speaker. And can I ask each of you very briefly to tell us who you are, starting with Helen Barnard.
I am Helen Barnard. I'm Director of Policy Research and Impact for the Trussell Trust.
Thank you. Maddy Rose.
Hello, I'm Maddy Rose. I'm a Policy Specialist at Mencap.
Morgan Wild.
Hello, I'm Morgan Wild, Policy at Citizens Advice.
Sally West.
I'm Sally West. I'm Policy Manager at Age UK.
Welcome all of you, and thank you all very much for joining us. Can I put the first question, and can I ask each of you how helpful you think the cost of living support payments have been, and the arrangements for them have been, for the people that your organisation works with? Starting with Helen Barnard.
So I think if you look at last year, if you look at it overall, we saw the highest need ever for food banks. So we gave out 3 million food parcels. That was a 37% increase on the year before, more than 1 million for children for the first time. So if you look at it overall, even with every bit of support that was put in, we were still seeing a lot of people in really dire hardship. When you then look in our data at what happens every time each cost of living payment comes in, what you can see really clearly is that they did definitely help. So when the first one came in July, we saw a dip of about 21% in terms of the need for our food banks compared to what we would have expected on the trend. Then the November one, we saw a dip of about 15% compared to what we would have expected in terms of the number of food parcels people needed. And in the most recent one that's just gone out in April, we saw a dip of 23%. So it clearly made a significant difference. But what you see is that was a very short respite. So the payments come out, people for between 1 and 3 weeks, you see that dip, then the need shoots up again, and in each case it went back up to, as it had been previously, a higher level of need than the year before. So in the most recent one that's gone out in April, we saw that dip. It didn't last very long, it lasted a shorter period of time than the others, but it shot up again. So in the first few weeks this year, we are already seeing levels of need higher than last year, which was itself significantly higher than the previous year. So I think that they clearly helped. They were delivered, they went in a targeted way to people who really needed them. They landed in people's bank accounts. You didn't have to apply. All that was good. But I think what it tells us is that one-off payments cannot respond to an ongoing level of income that's too low to cover the essentials. They can only ever give a short respite.
Thank you very much. Maddy Rose.
We've seen a similar picture. I think for many people with a learning disability, the cost of living payments just haven't reflected the challenges that they've experienced. And we know that 80% of disabled people have said that they just haven't been enough to cover their increased costs. As an organisation, we've seen a consistent degree of need for our helpline for people with a learning disability, their families and carers. Anecdotally, we know that the cost of living payments have often either been swallowed up by one large payment of a disproportionately high energy bill, because we know people with a learning disability often have higher energy needs than non-disabled people, or the cost of living payments have been defrayed across the wide number of extra costs that disabled people have. We've also found that even when people have been in receipt of the general cost of living payment, the disability cost of living payment, and their full benefit entitlement, they have still had to make profoundly difficult choices about whether they can afford their essentials. So in our recent survey, we found that 26% of people with a learning disability who responded reported not turning the lights on, 35% reported skipping meals, and 38% had not used their heating when they were cold. So I think that just indicates that hardship for people with a learning disability has persisted, even with the cost of living payments.
Thank you. Morgan Wild.
I'm going to add to the fairly bleak chorus from my colleagues here. So, just to give you a sense of context, we have had probably the bleakest start to the year as a service that we've ever seen. So we give advice on anything, but we roughly give advice on around 300 different topics. And for over 70 of those issues, we've broken all-time records this year. And when put that in the context of Us having been around over 80 years, we started at the outset of World War II. It's really something to be in the bleakest situation for people's living standards we've ever seen. The cost of living payments have helped. We've seen a similar temporary dip for people coming to us to access crisis support. That's typically referrals to food banks like the Trussell Trust network or charitable grants from local councils or other charities. You see that dip in the data for a month and then it goes away. You don't see that dip for our other key advice areas. So, for example, if you come to us for a budgeting exercise in debt advice, we are increasingly seeing that our advisors, even when they're going through your income, through your expenditure with a fine-tooth comb, they can't make the numbers add up. Over 50% of people coming to us are now in that situation if we're giving them debt advice. It's really quite a bleak overall picture.
Thank you very much. Sally West.
Like others, I mean, the payments have made an important contribution, and I think particularly combined with the other support that the government has given with energy bills. But I think the evidence that we're getting, both from the polling that we do regularly and also from the many people that contact us, is that for some people it isn't sufficient. People are still struggling with bills. I mean, perhaps to sort of pick out two groups, a lot of people tell us that they've got health conditions or disabilities. They need to keep their house particularly warm. They've got high laundry bills, high costs of extra food and things. And people in those situations are kind of really worrying about. The fact that they over the winter they were turning down the heating and they knew it wasn't doing any good for their health. They knew it was being affected. A woman whose husband had got dementia saying, and various other conditions, he doesn't understand why we can't have the house warm enough. I suppose the other group that seems to be coming to us increasingly are people who have a bit of savings or private pensions and thought that they had done enough to have a comfortable retirement, not luxurious, but get by and maybe have a bit over for a treat, maybe even save for a holiday, and are saying now, all my income is going on my regular outgoings. We got a private pension, we can't get any extra help, and they're drawing on savings. So I think people worried about getting by day to day. The weather's obviously getting warmer, so heating isn't such an issue, but they're still worried about the future. I read something from a woman in her 80s who said she's had to draw on her savings. She just about survived last winter, but she's really worried about next winter. So worrying about what's going to happen in the future as well.
Thank you very much. David Linden.
Thank you very much, Sir Stephen. Let's start with Ms West. Does targeting these cost living payments to those already in receipt of benefits, those most in need of support?
Well, I think targeting the sort of bulk of the help to people getting means-tested benefits obviously gets help to people who are in need by definition on a means-tested benefit because you have a low income. What we're finding is they don't reach everybody in need on a low income, and the two groups that we've particularly highlighted is those who should be getting pension credit because the people that we deal with, pension credit is the main passporting benefit for cost of living. So the people who are missing out because they haven't claimed pension credit, and I know this is an ongoing issue that the committee and other people have looked at, but take-up remains an important issue. And secondly, the people who are just over the pension credit level. And you could be £1, you could be 10p over the pension credit level, and that gives that cliff edge, whereas you don't get the support from the cost of living payment, £650, £900 in this year. And people can be worse off because they've got a small private pension than if they hadn't never saved for that and was claiming pension credit.
Ms Wild?
Yeah, so I fully endorse what Sally has said about pension credit. I had two further issues for people who aren't being reached. One is people who happen to receive what's called a nil award in universal credits at the time for their eligibility for the cost of living payments. We've seen huge numbers of people in that situation who would typically be in any given month be receiving a universal credit.
Who's been sanctioned, for example.
Exactly, somebody who's been sanctioned. We have seen cases where people are working part-time, they're receiving a universal credit payment, they cover a couple of shifts, that takes them just over the threshold, and because they're just over the threshold at the wrong point, it means that they aren't eligible for payment. It's been a huge issue, and people don't understand why they aren't receiving the support that they desperately need. The other issue has been people who are on non-income-based benefits, so things like housing benefit on the legacy system, contributory ESA and contributory JSA, who aren't receiving any other form of income-related benefits like universal credits. Those people haven't been eligible. Take housing benefit, for example, that probably affects around 100,000 working age households, around 370,000 pensioner households, many of whom would be eligible for pension credits. We know that most people in that situation will be on a low income and may be eligible for income-related benefits if they had applied. I think it's worth reflecting on the contributory benefits specifically, because I think that does create a real unfairness that if you happen to have made sufficient national insurance contributions to qualify for something like contributory ESA, you will perhaps be in a worse position than somebody on an income-based benefit.
Rose?
Similar to Sally, really, we found that vast numbers of people with a learning disability have been reached quickly and efficiently through the cost of living payments, but we are concerned that it hasn't reached everybody. And we're particularly mindful of people with a learning disability who are in need but are missing out on cost of living payment support because they aren't already claiming the benefits that they're entitled to because of barriers that they experience in the design and delivery of the welfare system. So that's a group that we're really, really concerned about.
Ms. Barnard?
So I think that you need to separate it into two different things. So using the social security system to target people, I think it's right. A lot of work went into designing a system which would make sure help gets to people who need it. I think the difficulty is if we choose to use that for these one-off payments, what it does is it magnifies unfairnesses in the system. But also it kind of drives a bit of a coach and horses through, universal credit is designed to have the taper, so you're always better off. Doing this then undoes that careful design, but that's purely because of the one-off payments, not because we're using social security. The only other group to add to what colleagues have said that we've heard people are concerned about missing out are people with no recourse to public funds or people waiting to move on to UC because of immigration status.
Yeah. If we can turn now to low-income households who are not eligible for the cost of living payment, and thinking specifically of people who are struggling with in-work poverty, starting with yourself, Ms. Barnard, have you seen more households coming forward not eligible for the cost of living payment, struggling more than those who've received them?
So I would say probably not, because if you're not eligible for the cost of living payments, it's because generally your income is high enough you don't qualify for universal credit. So I think we do know that people who are on universal credit are much more likely to be going without essentials than people who aren't. But I think you're right that there is that group of people who are a very small amount above the threshold or have fluctuating incomes. So we do see a lot of people coming to food banks in insecure work. That seems to be a big issue, and I think you're right. These kinds of one-off payments are going to be very inconsistent in whether those people happen to qualify at any one time.
Okay. Does anybody in the panel want to add anything to that already?
I'll just add, really endorse on the points that it makes the last pound of universal credit way too important for people, and lots of people rightly won't have applied for those. I would just add that I really do buy the points that people just outside the system have struggled a great deal. One of the things that we've argued for to sit in concert with the social security system is to have an energy social tariff to reflect the fact that this crisis is not just about incomes, it's about people's situations, it's about how hard their homes are to heat, and you need a system for making sure those people, whether they're inside universal credit or not, receive the support they need.
Just to add to Morgan's point on the impact that people's situation has, we've definitely found that the need is most acute amongst people with a learning disability on benefits and in receipt of cost of living payments. But we have seen families who aren't in receipt of significant state welfare support, but who have been particularly affected by high energy bills. They may have a child who has a medical condition that requires significantly increased energy. We've heard of some households who are having energy bills of up to £1,000 higher than the average. So they're experiencing real hardship. And part of that is because there's a chasm between the underlying household incomes of households with a disability and those without. The Resolution Foundation put the figure at 44% if disability social security is not included, which I think just exposes the fact that disabled people are hugely vulnerable to the rises in cost of essentials, regardless of if they're in receipt of high levels of benefit support or not.
Okay, and Stephen, I've just got one final question.
Very briefly, if you would.
It's just in relation to I've seen a constituency case from Lanarkshire where somebody had a joint claim with a then partner for universal credit. The couple split up and that person was not eligible for the cost of living payment. Do you have recommendations as to how we might be able to ensure that those who miss out on payments can be supported in future?
I think the main thing is don't rely on one-off payments in a moment of time. If we were putting the money into making the underlying rate of benefits adequate, then I think the system could deal with that. If we're using one-off payments, you will always get these circumstances of when it will be unfair.
Thank you, Sir Stephen.
Thank you very much. Desmond,
which are better, the cost of living payments or an increment to regular monthly benefits, bearing in mind that the increment during the pandemic was only paid to universal credit? And there is undoubtedly a number of people who believe that the one-off costs, large one-off costs, are better addressed by the cost of living payments.
I would echo what Helen has just said, and I think the evidence is pretty clear, but from a policy design it's better to have increments to universal credit than a system of one-off payments. That does have certain drawbacks. So, as you mentioned, there were ongoing problems with the legacy system in trying to extend the £20 uplift to that system. So it may be the case that while we maintain the legacy system, you need a parallel system of one-off payments for them while having an uplift for everybody else. They would make the entire process a lot smoother for the people who are coming to us, and as Helen says, it would remove a great degree of arbitrariness in who receives the payment. There are other things that would need thinking through, like interaction with the benefits cap and interaction with two-child limit, depending on how you applied the increase in the base rate, but I think clearly superior to one-off payments.
I think the only other thing I would add to that is I think we need to think about stability of income as well as amount of income. When people are getting by on very low levels of income, they are doing a lot of financial juggling. They're generally trying to pay off debts. They're trying to work out which bill to get into arrears with at which time. They are doing incredibly tight budgeting. And having fluctuating payments makes that far harder. And when you add into that most of these people who are in work, many people are already having to deal with earnings which are not steady. I think we would want the social security system to help people stabilise their finances, not create an even more unstable situation for people. It makes it very hard to plan and to budget effectively.
Thank you very much. Steve McCabe.
Thank you. I want to ask a couple of quick questions about the £150 disability cost of living payment. So I think I want to ask Maddy. You said in an earlier answer there that you didn't think everyone who was eligible had actually received the payment. Are you able to put a figure on that? Do you have a notion of the numbers or the percentage who missed out?
No, we're not. And like I said, we're confident that the vast numbers of people have received the payment. So eligibility has not been our primary concern. It has been really about the payment amount itself and the extent to which it has essentially been inadequate and hasn't.
I just wondered when you mentioned that if it was a significant figure. The other point is you say, Mencap say that the £150 is inadequate. What would you do instead?
Well, I think there's 2 points really. I think if government were intending on making additional one-off payments, they would need to be at a much higher rate and would actually need to be commensurate with the need for people with a learning disability. £150 has been inadequate. It has effectively just replaced the warm home discount payment that many disabled people received. And are now ineligible for, since 290,000 people were removed from that scheme who normally receive it. But I think a more sustainable long-term solution is obviously those benefit uprates that colleagues have discussed before. Those regular increases in income would just have a profound effect on people with a learning.
I just want to push you on this. What is a much higher rate?
Well, I think it's difficult to put a figure on it because it depends on people's needs, their disabilities, the nature of the suite of government support that's in place. If improvements are made to local support, then that would obviously have an effect on the rate that, a suitable rate that we could suggest. So I think before I say the number, I think it would what I would advocate for is an independent review of it so that there's a clear rationale that meets the need of people.
I just wonder if you had a figure in mind. I better leave it there.
Thank you. Debbie Abrahams.
I don't know if Helen wants to carry on from that, because I know Trussell Trust and JRF have been doing a lot around that. It doesn't specifically relate to disabled people, but do you want to mention?
Yes, thank you. So we've done research with Joseph Rowntree Foundation and found that if you're a single person, to cover your basic costs, your essentials, so food, basic household goods, bills, you need £120 a week. That's without the additional costs that disabled people face. So I would say that is the absolute minimum that we would want to see everyone getting, so that people aren't left, hungry, cold, in the dark, which is what we're seeing at the moment.
Just to add on that, I think one thing it would be useful to understand from the government is what kind of process they went through to come up with the estimate of £150 for disabled people. I think it's relatively well understood what the additional costs are for disabled people along a variety of different impairments, and certainly we have seen that the cost of living crisis for Citizens Advice clients has been overwhelmingly driven by disability. So if you come to Citizens Advice and you're disabled, you are more likely to come to us about a cost of living issue than you are any other problem.
Thank you. Maddy, can I just pick up and get you mentioned before in terms of the scope extra cost report and so on, and it has gone up dramatically, hasn't it? £1,122 a month extra cost if you consider inflation as well. We know that 1 in 3 disabled people will be living in poverty, double that of non-disabled people. Does the £150 extra, we welcome it, but the £150 extra cost for, in terms of disability, cost of living payment, doesn't really touch the sides, does it?
No, not at all. It's equivalent to £2.88 per week, which just isn't clearly not commensurate with the need, particularly when if you're mindful of the extra costs that people with a learning disability have, and how they've been disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis, particularly on two measures of household income. One, food. We know that people with a learning disability tend to have certain foods they need to have because of medical or sensory needs, and a lot of those costs are fixed, so household expenditure can't be changed around that. So that's been really impactful. And then again, yes, secondly, on energy, we know that many disabled people have significantly increased energy needs and can't cut down on those because they might be using energy for mobility and hygiene needs, running electric wheelchairs, hoists, more frequent use of washing machines, running vital medical equipment, oxygen concentrators, ventilators, feeding tubes, which are just vital and can't be switched off. And then other needs that pertain to health conditions. People's homes might need to be heated to a certain temperature, or people might be experiencing the increased energy costs of overnight or 24-hour carers. So all of that has kind of created this perfect storm where people with a learning disability are disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis, but also starting this whole crisis from a place of real economic inequality, like you said, more likely to experience poverty, having to contend with those significant extra costs in the disability price tag. But again, with the group that we support, people with a learning disability have fewer opportunities, paid work, so they can increase their household income. So, they're just far less able to.
Thanks, Maddy. That's really briefly, Sir Stephen. Child poverty statistics came out this week. We've seen a massive increase in many areas. It's not uniform across the UK. In my own constituency, it's nearly 1 in 2 children will be living in poverty. The big increase, Stephen, as you all know, is the increase in children living in poverty in working families, up to more than 7 in 10. 7 in 10. And destitution level poverty. So what difference has the cost of living payment made to child poverty? Who wants to tackle that one very quickly, because I don't want to drop the patience of the chair.
So I would say it has certainly helped those families that have got it, but of course it's a flat payment. It's not calibrated for the number of people you're trying to feed, so it has clearly gone less far if you're a family with children than if you're a single person or a couple. And I think it's worth saying, so with the food bank statistics, we've seen a faster rise in need among families with children than we have among families without children. So I think, that's obviously another argument to use the system as it's designed, because it has built-in calibration to family size and so on.
The only thing to add is single parents is the thing that jumps out in our data more than anything else. We see a vastly disproportionate number of people who are single parent families coming to us for crisis support, or coming to us because they can't make their budget add up.
Yeah, it would be useful, don't please answer this, but to get some figures in terms of how the Essentials Guarantee may impact on reducing that child poverty level. Thank you, Sir Stephen.
Thank you very much. Selaine Saxby.
Thank you and good morning. My question specifically to you, Sally, is about following on from the written evidence that we received. It said that many of those eligible for pension credit don't receive it and as a result miss out on cost of living payments on top. From your experience, do you have any indication of how many people that is, or the proportion of pensions it's impacting? Please.
Well, the latest DWP figures are now a couple of years out of date. They're 2019 to 2020, and that was about a third of pensioners who should be getting pension credit missing out. That's nearly 800 pensioner families. Since then, they probably take-up has increased a bit, but we don't think there's been huge inroads into that. It would be good to have some more up-to-date figures. But yes, I think we can say that it continues to be a kind of a big problem. People not claiming pension credit, and indeed other benefits that they're entitled to.
And the government's obviously runs a significant schemes, and I represent North Devon, so I have a lot of pensioners in my own patch, and I have done numerous photo shoots with the pension minister to try and actually put this out, just to try and encourage those people that haven't come forward. And we've obviously had evidence here before, but do you have any other thoughts? Is that helping, or is there another way that we could reach these people to persuade them to apply for what they're entitled to?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really positive that the last sort of year or so the government has been going out proactively with messages about encouraging people to claim. And, you know, a lot of the messages that we put out are kind of similar. We kind of work together. Using the sort of deadline for pension credit in order to get the cost of living payment has been a really useful hook. That's really important for awareness raising, which we need to continue doing. I don't think awareness raising on itself is going to reach everybody, because it's not just about knowing that a benefit like pension credit exists. You've got to know that it applies to you in your own particular circumstances. You've got to know where you can get help if you need it, and there are other barriers around people not wanting to ask for help, or, you know, older people say, oh, there's people worse off than me, you know, I'll just turn the heating down. So what we think that the government could do is, first of all, well, use data matching more to identify people who are missing out, and also making the systems more joined up. So in terms of data matching, ideally people would receive pension credit automatically, but we know that government doesn't have all the information. You know, there isn't all the information, wouldn't be able to tell you exactly who could get pension credit and how much they could get. But if you think of the data that HMRC have, that DWP have, that local authorities have, if all that could be sort of used to try to pinpoint those who are most likely to be entitled, and then you could target them with very clear information saying, you know, we know that you've got this kind of pension, you know that we get this, we think it's very likely that you'll get X amount of pension credit, this is where you can get help and support to claim. So we think it'd be really useful to have a project that look at, to the extent that government can use existing data to identify and then really target information and support to people. I think the second thing is looking how systems work, and in particular I'm thinking of the three main means-tested benefits for pensioners, which are pension credit, housing benefit and council tax reduction. So they're the three benefits that people may be able to get in order to help with their sort of daily living and their housing costs. But they're not fully joined up, even though the rules, they're based on similar rules. Council tax rebate councils can set their own rules, but not for pensioners. It's a standard rule for pensioners. Housing benefit is national rules. If you apply for pension credit, the information can be passed to the local authority. You've still got to make a claim within a certain time, and then that information is there, but you've still got to go through another step. If you apply for council tax rebate or housing benefit, that information isn't then passed to pension credit, even if it's all the information that pension service needs to work out your claim. So some local authorities will be doing exercises to look at their data and identify people who are maybe entitled. And again, they would have to go and say, you know, make a claim for pension service. But it just feels like, you know, those three benefits should be a lot more joined up, so that, you know, if you approach either the local authority or the pension service and you provide all the data needed to make the claim, your entitlement for all the three benefits should be worked out.
Thank you for that. And do you have any thoughts on what would be the best way for the government to support those pensioners who just missed out on those cost of living payments?
Yeah, this is such a big issue. As I mentioned earlier, people who perhaps got a small amount of savings, brings them just over the pension credit rate. This includes quite a lot of people who are getting housing benefit or council tax rebate, as I mentioned. And I mean, we feel the best way is to extend payments to people getting all of those means-tested benefits. I mean, we have had people coming to us to say, well, you know, I've heard the government saying there are these extra payments for people getting means-tested benefits. You know, it says on the government website, housing benefit is means-tested, but I'm told I can't receive anything. So I think because these are means-tested benefits, that would help take that extra support a bit, sort of slightly bigger group.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sally, can I just add, do you think a significant number of pensioners have applied for pension credit in order to qualify for the cost of living payment?
think it's certainly been a good hook and a good sort of trigger to encourage people to claim. We have had, certainly at Age UK, we've had more people coming for help. Some of them will undoubtedly go on to make a claim for pension credit. Increasingly, our local advisors are saying people are coming to us for help. We'd normally do a benefit check, but this time we can't offer anything extra. So it's difficult to know. And of course, the government information, they can tell you how many additional or how many claims were made in a month. They can't tell you which ones were successful for pension credit. You know, it would be very good to be able to judge how successful take-up campaigns and different initiatives are, but the systems don't seem to allow that.
Okay, thank you. Siobhan Baillie.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry about my voice. It's on the way out. So we've kind of touched on the fact the government tried to get money out quickly, and in doing so, they created a basically simple payment system, and using a mechanism that's already there, which is the benefit system, which is imperfect, but it was for speed. So I'm kind of interested to know from all of you whether you would sacrifice speed of payments for an attempt to be more bespoke and bring in sort of a targeted for size of household, for example, and whether you think that's important, and whether you think that could be accurately done at scale. So just to go to Morgan first.
Yeah, sure. So I think it could be accurately done at scale, and the reason is if you take universal credit by itself, there may be more complexities for the legacy system. But take universal credit by itself, there are basically two ways that you could increase universal credits to achieve the same effect as a cost of living payment. You could just increase the standard allowance by an equivalent amount, or you could, if you were more concerned about scaling payments with household size and other characteristics, you could grow each of the elements of universal credit proportionately, so that you are giving additional support in the way that is
wouldn't be on a one-off. This is on a more frequent basis. But on a one-off basis, do you think there is a mechanism?
I think you could do this on a one-off. Obviously, I think everybody here would also be of the view that a permanent increase is required because benefit rates are too low, but you could do this on a temporary basis, as we did with the £20 uplift.
Maddy?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Morgan said. I think it would just be really key to contend with those complexities that individuals who receive legacy payments experience, and I think it would just really depend on how it was operationalised, but we would be really keen to see that permanent increase in the benefit rate, just because it is so inadequate at the moment for people with a learning disability.
I'd echo that. I think one of the benefits of universal credit is it is very flexible. So you can choose to do an uplift very quickly, which, as we saw during the pandemic, it's only the legacy benefits where you have to do something more clunky and it takes longer. I mean, happily, I don't think that's now a choice the government has to make for most people. They don't have to choose between speed and accuracy because the system will let you do both.
Your view is that the payments should be adjusted for household and youth. Is that yes. What you were saying about families and people presenting to the food banks at the moment? Yeah,
so if you run it through universal credit, you can just use the existing system. So you can increase the standard allowance and the child element, for instance, and that would enable you to direct those payments. I mean, one thing that was very welcome was the government did ensure that they lifted the benefit cap so that people didn't miss out on extra help. Because they had hit that arbitrary limit. So you would need to do that as well. But I think the system is in general well designed to do what we need it to.
Perhaps not necessarily something for your clientele.
Yes. Most older people live in single person or couple households, so I'll leave that one to
your view of policy. Do you think that if we made the adjustment for households, do you think that it would then have an impact on single age working households, single person working households? Do you think there will need to be a trade-off because the payments couldn't continue across?
Well, I suppose an adjustment made reduced the amount for sort of people on their own. We wouldn't support that because often your costs are higher, but I think probably looking at giving extra support to larger households, so that would kind of be a different issue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Neil Coyle.
Thanks, Chair. Morgan, you painted the most stark picture of the situation facing people across the country. I think you said it was the bleakest in civil device history, including during the Second World War. How do you square that with closing the civil device bureau at the Blue in Bermondsey, in my constituency, which serves quite a disadvantaged community?
I would have to look at the specifics of that situation, but the challenges that we face as a service are extraordinary. We have vastly more demand than we are able to offer. Advice and funding has been under continuous pressure, so we're always looking for opportunities to make sure that we can reduce costs where possible while maintaining the overall level of provision for our services.
I think the civil device turnover was £154 million last year, and the mission statement is you won't struggle to get help from us. So I just wonder if you could share, perhaps, Chair, I appreciate it's not perhaps relevant to the whole committee, you could share some information about what other options were considered locally. If the rent was the primary issue for the move, then I wonder if there were other means of keeping a local facility that I'd be very happy to support if I can. I think it's an excellent service, and I'm very concerned about the loss to my community. But I wanted to ask about the number of organisations, including Child Poverty Action Group and Entitled To, have expressed concern about the cliff-edge nature of the eligibility criteria for cost of living payments. This has been touched on already, but I wonder, do any of your organisations have data on the number of people you're seeing affected by that specific issue?
Not specific data, but it's certainly a huge problem. We're seeing lots of people for whom they are just outside the threshold for receiving universal credit and therefore being ineligible for cost of living payments. I think it's probably the central issue that we see.
It's been touched on that people come to food banks, and you're saying there's a huge number, but how do you know? How is it logged in your systems that these are people who should qualify for support, aren't quite getting it? And then how are you turning that into recommendations for how to improve the system? Who else is it that would warrant better support? I think Morgan, you touched on energy, and someone else touched on single parents. But what is the database for the recommendation? What is the recommendation, please?
So I can touch on our data, but others will have comments as well. The driving factor in our data that informs how we think about this is people who are in what we call negative budgets. So people who come to us, they go through the full debt advice process, we go through their income and expenditure with a fine-tooth comb and still can't make their budgets add up. For lots of those people, they are on a low income but not receiving a cost of living payment, and it seems very, when you look at their situation, it looks very reasonable that because of their high heating costs, because of how this crisis has been driven by the energy crisis, there needs to be some solution that captures those group of people.
So I say from our experience, so the vast majority of people who are forced to turn to food banks are on a means-tested benefit, but it is not enough for them to afford essentials. That's why they're there. But it's also notable that an enormous proportion are not receiving all of what you would expect because they are affected by debt deductions at source, by the cap, by the two-child limit, or by sanctions. So I think there is that problem that even if you're on the benefit, you may not actually be getting everything that the system has assessed you as needing. What I would say, though, is what we do see is the majority of people coming to food banks are disabled, and most of those who aren't are living with someone who is. It's an enormous driver. But many of those people are not getting any disability-related benefits. Now, we obviously don't know for sure how many should be, but it is particularly problems getting PIP. So a lot of the financial inclusion advice that we're giving through food banks is trying to help people get PIP. And I know for the work we do with Citizens Advice with the helpline that we run jointly, that is, I think, the top benefit issue. So I think getting access to disability benefits is one of the biggest drivers of people ending up in this situation.
And I would add to that we also find a lot of older people are missing out on attendance allowance. So we've talked about pension credit take-up, which is getting more attention, but the other benefits like attendance allowance and like PIP are also, we don't have figures for them, but we know just from our day-to-day advice services that people are missing out on that. Just in terms of, so I was going to say in terms of the numbers just above pension credit for perspective of older people, I was saying earlier that we'd like to see cost of living payments extended to people who are getting housing benefit and council tax reduction. Looking at the figures, it looks like that might be around 400,000 pensioners who are getting a means tested benefit but not pension credit or pensioner households. But I can send you some information about those figures. But
that would be really helpful. And do any of your organisations support the Child Poverty Action Group's suggestion that those who apply for but got nil awards in universal credit get help as well? Is this something that there is a consensus on in the sector?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that looks positive. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask, particularly Morgan and Helen, a question I put to Sally. Have you seen people applying for benefit in order to get the cost of living payment? I mean, has this been helpful for benefit take-up, this size?
So if I look at our data before the cost of living crisis, we were helping around 10,000 people a month with a general benefits entitlement advice section. That's gone up to around 20,000 a month, so it has been a really big increase. Partly that's driven just by general cost of living concerns and people wanting to make sure that they are claiming benefits that they otherwise wouldn't. Anecdotally, our advisors say a big driver has been putting them in a position to claim cost of living payments.
Right.
So we haven't seen particularly it driving take-up, but one thing to mention is the DWP doesn't publicise which day, what is the qualifying day. And if the government was going to go down this route again, one thing they could do would actually be to publicise what is the qualifying day, because that could then be used as a call to action by people across the sector to say we've got to get you on this by this day. And that might be a more purposeful way to try and do that. I mean, we know, about £19 billion of benefits go unclaimed each year. It's about £7.5 billion for universal credit. So there are a lot of people missing out on all the support in addition to these extra payments.
The advantage with pension credit is that because you can get 3 months backdated payment, we have been able to say make a claim by a certain date, which indeed the DWP has done as well. So, as I said earlier, it's a very good hook to get publicity around benefits going unclaimed.
Morgan, in the Citizens Advice case, are people coming to you because of the cost of living payment, because it's in their mind that there could be a way of them getting that, or is it once they've come in, the advisors say, actually, you could qualify?
As you'd expect, it's a bit of a mix. So we see both kinds of cases.
Okay, some people at least are aware that this is an opportunity. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Nigel Mills.
And we've talked over the years about the danger of cliff edges and have those dangers come to pass? Have we seen people trying to avoid taking extra hours to make sure they don't max out their UC that month and miss out on 300 odd quid tax free? Have we seen strange behaviours creeping into the system that we probably didn't really want to see?
So if people were fully informed and following these things in as much detail as the rest of us, it would be the rational thing to do, particularly to Helen's point, but they don't advertise the take-up date, would be to suppress your income in the period where you know that a cost of living payment eligibility criteria is likely to fall. That'd be the sensible thing to do, given the scale of the money involved, and so you would expect it to have a potential chilling effect and run contrary to the very good intentions of universal credit in making sure that you are never worse off for earning an additional £1. Now, in practice, people probably aren't on average following with a degree of detail that those of us around this room would, but some people will be, and it's a very bad property of a policy system to encourage that kind of behaviour from people.
And I would only add that most of the people we're talking about are in a fairly dire situation, and if every week you are struggling to put food on the table and keep the lights on and seeing your bills and debt mounting up, I would be very surprised if there are people who could be earning more who decide not to that week or that couple of weeks. I think people don't have the level of financial buffer that would lead you to make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah. So the government response to this crisis was I remember these things now. We had the funny council tax in reverse thing, which worked quite well if you're on direct debit, was a bit fiddlier if you weren't. We then had the money back from your energy bill company spread over 6 months. We then had the cost of living payments, and we then had the capping of your energy bill directly by your supplier. If we're going to have another, heaven forbid, another crisis like this, I mean, which of those do you think actually was the right way to go about helping people? I mean, is it a combination of capping the bill and then support for those who can't afford the difference, or did you prefer one of the other options that was there?
If we could not do the council tax rebates again, that would be much appreciated. I think at the time we called it strange, complicated and untargeted, and I think it was probably a policy instrument that we should put to bed. On the other options, look, I think what we've ended up doing has been more expensive than it needed to be, because we have instantiated a energy price guarantee for everyone and then supplemented it with cost of living payments for those on lowest incomes, and we've done it in quite a, I would say, unstrategic way. It's been going from crisis to crisis rather than addressing the underlying cause. I think if we were to face this situation again, and I certainly wouldn't bet against us needing a third round of cost of living support, it would be much better to put in place a proper energy social tariff, which is reflective of the energy costs that people have based on their household characteristics and property condition, and that can reach out further up into the middle of the income distribution, because when energy bills go up as dramatically as they do, the demand for support won't just be needed by the poorest in society, it'll be needed much higher up as well.
Yes, I mean, we certainly support the idea of a social tariff. I guess you do need a combination of measures. So the social tariff is about reducing costs for those with the hardest to heat houses and the lowest incomes, and then you need to look at sort of decent incomes. Although I think, it's not ideal to be giving one-off lump sums, and we've talked quite a bit about, the need for a regular income. They have been important for people, and they have got some money out to a lot of people quite quickly. So ideally you wouldn't need further rounds of one-off sums, but they do serve a purpose, and maybe they will be needed.
And I would say we should try and learn from our experience. We've tried quite a lot of different things in the last few years, and rather than repeat any of them, so, council tax thing was obviously a disaster, and we should just all collectively forget about it. I think we've also learned that something that's fully universal just meant lots and lots of people got the money who genuinely didn't need it. We've learned that one-off payments help for a very short time, but don't actually help people get stable and be able to afford things. I think what we learned from the £20 uplift during the pandemic was we've had really good analysis of that, and that made such a big difference to poverty, to hardship, to debt, to all sorts of things. The only downside was it was again a flat rate. But I think what we've learned from all of these things is that we should use the tools that are designed for the job, which is the benefit system, and we should run whatever money we've got through that. And then something like a social tariff can take care of those people in the middle that we shouldn't be funneling lots of money to be honest, because most of the time they don't need it. But where there are kind of pockets of people who do, you can pick it up through that.
I would echo Helen's point, but I think it's key as well to draw out the fact that in these additional measures that we're discussing, like the social tariff, we need to think about those design elements that contend with the needs of people with a learning disability. So, for example, it needs to be automated, it needs to be easy for people to access, because we've seen the problems that have come to pass when government support, for example, the energy bill support schemes, there's been significant accessibility barriers for people with a learning disability, which has meant that they've been disadvantaged and haven't received the amount of support that they maybe should have.
I'm sort of intrigued that, quite rightly, we don't like the idea of asking councils to deal with this, even though they should know people in their area and they should be kind of like relatively benevolent organisations being public sector, but we think asking energy companies to work out which households to target based on the quality of their housing, how many people in there, what sort of income they have, is a realistic thing you could roll out quickly. It kind of feels really quite hard.
Yeah, it's definitely not a realistic thing to roll out quickly. The data on property characteristics is collected already by the Valuation Office Agency under what was formerly based on. Not sure where it sits now. So all of that data exists and is already used in matching for the warm home discounts. There are additional complexities, mostly in reaching beyond universal credit, because that would require integration with HMRC data potentially. But the principle of being able to target based on how hard a home is to heat is fairly well established. On the council tax reduction part, I think that the key difficulty was in both in how payments were processed if you weren't in direct debits payments, as you mentioned, also the imperfect grading of different homes, leading to lots of people being left out. I think there is a place for local welfare assistance through continuation and boosting of household support fund for people in crisis situations, but that should principally be for people in crisis rather than what we've seen, which is grants to help people with their ordinary living costs.
I just ask as a final thing, one of our favourite topics we come back to. I mean, this was an inflation crisis, and benefits generally go up by inflation. I mean, have we just exposed the fact that putting up benefits in April via the inflation number in September is actually not a particularly useful way of trying to keep something that's meant to provide a standard of living to keep up with the standard of living that you want, if you're always quite so far behind and quite so unresponsive to it?
Yeah, I mean, it is, I think for a lot of periods of history it's been fine because inflation just hasn't changed that much. But you're right, this has exposed the fact that in an unusual period you can get these effects. I mean, I think there is the government does have the ability to choose to put it up by more than the previous September's inflation. It's entirely in their gift to say we will actually put it up by the current inflation, for instance. And the way that UC works, there's no technical reason you couldn't do that. So I think in a sense it's a kind of political choice how you want to kind of spread that spending.
Yeah, I think if you look at the historical data, September doesn't have any kind of special magic properties as a month to look at inflation. In fact, I think it was mostly chosen because historically under the legacy system it genuinely was more difficult. We've got a good system now, so let's use that flexibility to increase benefits in a way that isn't just tied to the idea of look at a single month's inflation, but actually involves a degree of judgment about what does the inflation landscape look like? Are we expecting bills to continue going up for a longer period? Well, then let's make sure that we're over-aiming on increasing benefits.
Yes, I mean, I think having that 6 months lag, as I said, is particularly unfortunate at the time when bills have soared so much. And sometimes it works in people's favours, to be honest. Inflation can fall, but I mean, it's been really serious this year. And it feels like 6 months ought to at least be reduced a bit, even if you kept the same kind of system. DWP may tell you that's not possible, but it just feels like they ought to be able to get that gap shorter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the questions we wanted to put to you. Thank you all very much indeed for joining, for the very helpful information you've given.
Thank you.